Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe, and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's discussion. This is the fourth virtual event in a three-day symposium hosted by the American Council on Germany and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung USA, titled 6 Months into the Biden Presidency, Transatlantic Trends and Aspirations. This week, we've been looking at the transatlantic partnership from a variety of perspectives. Yesterday, we had a session that focused on opportunities for collaboration in security and defense policy, and then also an event on climate policy, energy, and the environment. In today's session, we'll bring the focus to the national and even the local level and talk about infrastructure as communities in both countries and on both continents grapple with various infrastructure systems that are not able to provide the services that they need to in the 21st century. For this panel, we're joined by three experts. Greg Lindsay is the Director of Applied Research at NewCities and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Foresight, Strategy, and Risks Initiative. A well-regarded journalist and urbanist and futurist, he joined NewCities in June 2015 to lead the Connected Mobility Initiative and assumed his current role in 2019. Greg, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Steve. Thank you for having me.
Brandie Lockett is a multidisciplinary city designer based in Houston. Her work is at the nexus of architecture and urban design with a special focus on neighborhood development. She's worked on projects in Europe and the United States, and she's currently Deputy Assistant Director and Urban Designer for the City of Houston in the Houston Public Works Infrastructure Planning and Policy Branch. Brandie, it is terrific to see you again. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me, Stephen.
And last but not least, and certainly the furthest away, is Thomas Puls, who is in Cologne, where he's the Senior Economist for Transportation and Infrastructure at the Institut der deutschen Wirtschaft, or German Center for Economics. He joined the Institute in 2002, and his work focuses on the intersection of environment, energy, and infrastructure. Thomas, herzlich willkommen.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So even in reading each of your bios a little bit, it's great to see how infrastructure, transportation, and the environment come together. And it's been really fascinating over the last few months to look at how infrastructure has been such a hot topic on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's really no wonder, because we hear about failing, aging, outdated infrastructure, but we're also exploring new modes of transportation, and we hear about aspirational new kinds of infrastructure as well. It seems to me that almost every day there's an article or a report in the US and the European media about infrastructure. And this is especially true today. President Biden is in Ohio, where he's expected to talk about infrastructure, and the Senate is slated to have a procedural vote on the infrastructure bill today as well. I think, as most of our viewers know, the Biden administration is pushing a massive infrastructure plan that will upgrade roads, bridges, and water systems. It will expand digital access and broadband and hasten the shift to clean energy, and in the process, create millions of jobs. At the same time, the EU's $800 billion recovery fund also focuses on addressing climate change and the digital transformation as part of its economic recovery plan. But as I reflected on today's conversation, there was an overarching question for me, and that is, what do we mean when we talk about infrastructure? Because it seems to mean different things to different people depending on their focus and on their interests. And it was hammered home to me in yesterday's conversation about national security and then the conversation about climate policy, because many of the speakers talked about infrastructure, but I'm not sure that they were always talking about the same thing. So I thought it would be great if we could start today's conversation by having each of you provide a definition of infrastructure and what you believe should be included when we think about this topic. And Brandie, I'd like to start with you to sort of get your take on infrastructure, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, thank you, Stephen, one, for asking me to join the conversation. It's always a pleasure to contribute with ACG. So I work at the local level. I work for the city of Houston. I'm an architect, and I work in public works at the city. And so I probably deal with the idea of infrastructure as the built environment, probably more in a literal sense. And I found it, the more and more I started in the private sector, and the more and more I get on the kind of public agency governing side, the more I start to think of, how are we building our cities to be these better places for people to just be? What does that infrastructure mean to us as a city? And so as a designer, I've been working on that in between planning phases and engineering phases, and how our cities are built, and so kind of driven by engineering regulatory kind of strategies and thoughts. And so that missing link, when I understand cities and how our cities are built up, and how I think of how people really drive the needs of our cities, I'm starting to see that missing link of understanding people's patterns and how they kind of identify infrastructure and the use of infrastructure, and identify what is needed in our cities to be that built environment that kind of make our cities what they need to be to operate more functionally. And so I see infrastructure as being many things, but I really see that infrastructure is, not only how people move, but how people want to kind of interact with their city. And that can be not only transit, that could just be, our open and our public spaces. I think one thing that I learned during our prime COVID months was that there were more people in our open and public spaces than there were on our roadways, right? And so infrastructure was kind of defined by where people actually wanted to go, where people wanted to experience. They wanted to be outside. They overtook our streets. We overtook our streets. We overtook public spaces that weren't designated as public spaces. And so creativity came out. Infrastructure started to be developed in, our sidewalks, our curb to curb streets, our building face to building face. All of that became different types of infrastructure. Our bayous here in Houston became different ways how people got to these nodes of interest that people were curious about when they didn't have the opportunity to kind of take advantage of them. And so from that design perspective, looking at the built environment, as these tall buildings are these places that we inhabit from the interior, that we started to not look at that as kind of that prioritized infrastructure, but how do we kind of make our cities more accessible? How do we make these places that people would like to get to faster, quicker? And so there was a rethink internally, at least within Houston, and I think within the design network, of what it means to what as a city do we prioritize to invest in our cities to be more functional, healthy, more welcoming places. And so there's kind of like this redefining, I think, lane that we're going through now to understand what infrastructure means to the city of Houston. And I could elaborate in so many ways, but I think that starting from that bottom-up approach to make more kind of closer networking, community-based, design-driven strategies is how, at least the direction that we would like to take to understand more, kind of people-based, data-based kind of infrastructure and network.
Thanks, Brandie. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as I was listening to you speak, it sounded to me almost like you look at infrastructure as the glue that keeps the city together and that keeps the city running, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I do see that, but I really think that, it's got to be understanding the patterns of people. And from that, I think that we could probably prioritize infrastructure in a more people-based needed direction, instead of identifying what we believe high impact infrastructure needs to be.
Thanks. Thank you, Brandie. Greg, understanding the patterns of people, right? That's something that Brandie was just talking about, and certainly that's something that you've worked on in some of your work on mobility and elsewhere, as you've looked at how cities work and how cities function. Can you share with us your definition of infrastructure and what the various elements are that we should be thinking about when we think about it?
Yeah, I love this question, Steve, because it makes you realize either whether you're an infrastructure minimalist or maximalist in your definition. I think Senator Manchin is probably a minimalist in the sense of it's about roads and bridges. And I am determinedly a maximalist in the sense of I think of infrastructure as the sort of supporting armature of everyday life to improve human well-being and perhaps improve productivity, innovation. We could add all sorts of positive attributes. But it's this armature, and it has to go beyond the physical infrastructure as well into these softer forms. And I think if there's one thing that the pandemic really underscored for all of us, it's the fact that childcare for working parents is infrastructure. Schools and education is infrastructure in its own form, obviously. All of these things that add up. And just two quick examples of that in terms of thinking about that. Why my colleagues at the Atlantic Council has published a series of reports on how America should retain its innovation edge, and the recommendations sound, to me at least, like a Democratic Party fantasia, because it's all about increasing diversity and inclusion into the workforce, increasing education, building out a stronger social safety net, all of these things to increase human potential. That's what they identified as infrastructure in a very depoliticized form in those reports, which I thought was interesting. And then at NewCities, I published a report last year in the run-up to the election, looking at sort of what millennials would likely do in the years to come. Already, of course, a generation that is facing soaring housing prices and a lack of a social safety net. What would the new administration do? And yeah, I think if there's one thing that I take away from being based in Montreal, where the province of Quebec has a very strong social safety net in the form of subsidized childcare, which Prime Minister Justin Trudeau intends to take nationally, that's one core area for the United States to invest in. And of course, the child credits that President Biden has done is a great first step. But we saw nearly half of all daycares in the United States poised to close or collapse under the pandemic stresses. So how do we bolster that? And so I could go on and on there, and obviously there's a climate discussion as well, but yeah, how do we think about, what are the social support structures in here? And from the context of, for a German audience, I love the press clips arguing that President Biden is finally going to make America into a social democracy, what it should have been a long time ago, in my opinion. So there's an endless checklist of, I think, things that, the United States could learn from its transatlantic partners in all these areas. And I'll let Thomas go next here, but I want to come back to, also what should be done in the areas of housing as well, which is also, I think, a way to think about infrastructure. We have to think about it as infrastructure in the midst of a housing crisis, which has only gotten worse. And then one final point, obviously, is, the other thing the pandemic has done is that the pandemic in the United States drove a discussion that didn't really happen anywhere else, which is, are cities dead and will people flee from cities? And it did fuel people to move to more sprawling, lower density areas with more affordable housing, which, as we can discuss, during the apparent climax of climate change, as we're seeing right now with wildfire smoke across the entire North American continent, this was an individual rational response at exactly the wrong time. And so how do we try to put some of that genie back into the bottle to have patterns of living and moving that will spare us the worst of warming, of 2 centigrade or more warming? But with that, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, thanks, Rick, because I really like your notion of the minimalist versus the maximalist when thinking about infrastructure. I think it comes down to, does one really just think about bridges and roads and traditional forms of infrastructure, or does one take a step back and look more broadly? And that's where your view of infrastructure dovetails very, very nicely with what Brandie was describing from a city perspective. So let's go across the Atlantic to Thomas. Thomas, obviously you have been working on transportation and infrastructure issues for many, many years in Cologne. I thought that Greg was throwing some balls to you in terms of talking about the social safety net and different ways of thinking about infrastructure. In your work, how do you define infrastructure?
Well, I have to admit my definition of infrastructure changed over the time. Actually, it became more maximalist. the longer I worked with German politics and so on. When I started in this job, I studied economics and had a very textbook definition of infrastructure, just the basic equipment of an economy with the character of intermediate inputs for private economic activity. Well, that's it. And my issue was transportation, but over the time, my perception changed. It went much more to infrastructure is everything that connects people and companies, all the stuff that enables us to function as a society, as an economy, quite comparable with the human body. We have blood vessels, we have nerves. All this is, in my definition, part of the infrastructure. And it leads us to the conclusion, shortcomings in the infrastructure always hinder the well-being of the whole. So I think I became much more maximalistic over the time, even though my focus is on the blood vessels, the transportation, and my colleagues work on social issues and so on.
But Thomas, if you let me push you on that, and I think it ties in with some of the things that Brandie and Greg have said already. It almost seems as if one just looks at those blood vessels in a vacuum, if you will, that you lose sight of the bigger picture and you lose the context within which those blood vessels are functioning. So if you're just looking at traditional infrastructure, transportation, roads, streets, buildings, bridges, you might not understand the bigger picture. So how do you try to reconcile those two vantage points, if you will, in your work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I try to use the infrastructure of our institute and take the input of all the colleagues who work on housing, social structure, healthcare, and so on and so on. And that's the reason why my definition changed over the time, because I got more and more to the point that all these issues have heavy influence on my little transportation issue. You can't think the road construction without communications and so on and so on and so on, because in the end, transport is always just the result of other decisions. The decision to locate your housing, your working place, and your social behavior. So, yeah, it's an enabler, but it's a kind of service.
Thank you, Thomas. Each of you in your comments have sort of touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to drill down a little bit further and talk about where the greatest need is, where the biggest deficits are when it comes to existing infrastructure, and where you think investment is needed most. Obviously, both in the US and in Europe, there's a lot, and in Germany, there's a lot of discussion about investing in infrastructure. And so I'd like to ask each of you where you see the biggest shortcomings and the greatest needs. And Thomas, why don't you go first from a German perspective, and then we'll go to Greg and Brandie.
Mm-hmm. Well, from the classical infrastructure, I think our main problems changed in the last years. We had a long time of underinvestment, which resulted in problems with building conditions on bridges and a rather bad data network communications and so on and so on. But in the last years, actually investment was ramped up, especially in the transportation sector, for example. And then we had to acknowledge that we had much more problems than we thought. We had problems with finance before, but after that, it turned out our bureaucratic procedures were also a big issue. Now we have money and we can't use it because we don't have projects ready to build, for example. That's an rather intriguing problem. The same in the traditional infrastructure is capacity of the building and construction industry. there is nothing left, especially when I think about the flood regions now. It could be difficult to find someone to repair anything. And actually, 1 week ago, I sat on this chair, looked out of this window, and was lamenting about the perspective about my second bicycle ride in the rain. 1 day later, I learned that how much damage was done, and therefore I had to rethink my lamenting of the further day. And I think it showed us very clear that adaptation to climate change must become a much bigger issue in our infrastructure debates. There was a lot of damage that might come that has much to do with the age of the infrastructures that were damaged and with the region. That's a mountainous area which had much rain, and now as anything, especially bridges and communication lines and so on, are really heavily damaged. And we have to rethink before we start rebuilding, because the probability of another flooding is actually rising. Therefore, I think adaptation to climate change will become a much bigger issue from now on. We have to take this serious.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you also for pointing to the future, because certainly in the course of the conversation, I wanted to talk about plans for the future, because each of you in your work are trying not just to look at the past and the present, but really create sort of a path forward and try to make decisions about things that we can only anticipate at the moment, or might evolve, might happen, but not that are guaranteed to happen. And so that's incredibly difficult. So Greg, I mean, as somebody who thinks a lot about the future, as you think about the current deficits and where the greatest investment is needed to really try to build a robust infrastructure for tomorrow, what are your priorities? Where do you sort of see the emphasis?
This is one of those questions where do you start? Well, not to be too glib, but I would say the last thing we need are roads and bridges. And I mean that somewhat seriously. I'm encouraged by the recent decision by the Welsh government that they will build no more roads, that they will maintain current network and begin to sunset some of their road network as part of their efforts to reduce carbon emissions. And of course, what the EU's proposed by effectively, removing petrol-based vehicles off the roads through its cap and trade system. So, and that I think is a form of infrastructure too, thinking about how do we put in, binding mechanisms to eliminate, driving and other forms of carbon emissions. So, for example, one area I think the United States needs is, vehicle mile tax, VMT. I've worked with a startup called ClearRoad that's proposing this, that would put digital software in every car to effectively turn all of America into a tolled environment if governments were to go that route. That's a kind of technology that I think we need to invest in to change behavior. But, I obviously sort of two areas stand out. One, I mentioned housing. I mean, I think, obviously housing is a form of infrastructure, especially as over the past year and a half of the pandemic, it sort of drew in every other form of real estate into it. It's now a place where you work, and it's a place where you shop, and it's a place where it's delivered. So where we build housing and how we build it is critical. And again, that's where I think, things like Passive House, which is becoming more robust in Europe, should be adopted more broadly in the United States. There's a lot of work to be done in changing building codes and enabling that. And then finally, I think one which I won't get too much into because I don't hear Brandie or talk about it, of course, is public transportation. I think is a big one. One more after this, not finally, but public transportation. I mean, we saw, that the various systems in New York and elsewhere, suffered massive drop-offs in ridership, and the entire U.S. system that's based so much on fare box recovery needs to change. We need to change our entire conception about it, about thinking of it as a public good and investing in it and just assigning more tax dollars to build out service. Again, things the United States can learn from Germany. I learned recently that all three of the commuter rail systems in New York City, which is, 40% of all U.S. trips, combined are smaller than Munich's S-Bahn, which is not even, Thomas will tell me, which is not even a major S-Bahn compared to the Berlin network. So much.
No, probably not.
So much can be done there in the States if we were to invest in it versus, and there has been some recent signs there of local voters voting to invest in transit. Although I think, there it's a question of they want you to ride the train so they can drive to work. That certainly happened in Los Angeles. But then finally, and this is where I think it gets potentially contentious, and I recently wrote about this, is I would take one step further from Thomas, which is we have to go beyond climate adaptation to thinking about climate migration and managed retreat strategies. As we're seeing in this past week and month, no place is safe. There is no outside from climate disaster, but some areas are riskier than others. And the whole US pattern of investing in some of the riskiest areas of the Sun Belt, particularly in Florida and California, where insurers are battling state governments to just drop coverage on people's homes, we need to, basically guide development into areas that are more climate safe, whether that's, temperate coastal California, where Los Angeles homeowners will fight you to the death to prevent you from having more people live there, or, basically sort of tightening up some of the patterns in Florida and elsewhere. And so we need to think about it. And we also need to think about where to invest infrastructure. And I recently wrote an op-ed arguing that, that we need to direct investment towards the Great Lakes, where those cities were built for populations twice their size in places like Detroit and Buffalo and elsewhere. So how can we make investments and use federal dollars to sort of try to put a thumb on the scales to increase more climate resilient investment? So that's at the top of my wish list.
That's a great list. And I think a very good starting point. Gives us also a lot of things to drill down into later in the conversation. But before we do that, Brandie, let me come to you and ask from really a local perspective. I mean, it was interesting to hear Greg talk about some of the developments in some cities, perhaps even the movement of people away from some cities to new regions. How are you looking at investment in infrastructure in Houston? Where do you see the biggest deficits and where do you see the greatest needs?
Yeah, that's so, but to that point, I think, Greg, I wanted to thank you for that case study, because I'm going to look into the Welsh saying no more roads. That's something that Houston really needs to take a case study to our next board meeting. It's something I've been fighting with them. We've got a really big, roadway projects going on, and the argument that, where we should actually prioritize and invest governing funding, it continues to go into, the high impact infrastructure, which we greatly need less of. But I would say that, Houston has three really well thought out comprehensive projects that we are prioritizing. One, of course, is the Vision Zero, making sure that we eliminate as many crashes and death impacts from vehicle to people moving on our streets as pedestrians. The other one is our bike plan. We've got, we're prioritizing. Houston is, I think it doesn't get as much credit as it probably should, as being a place where people actually do love to bike. And so investing in our bike plan, 1,800 miles of, high capacity bike facilities within our road networks. And then we have our other NAHIP, which is it's a controversial project because it is a high capacity roadway project. And it's the argument that it's dividing, historically based neighborhoods within our city, but it's, what it will do to connect our overall region. And so it's a very combative project. It's got its greats, it's got its not so greats, but it's something that, we're debating right now in Houston, but it could be a very influential project. And then our slow streets, one of the networks that I know cities around the world have been involved in. But for me, I kind of probably have tunnel vision when it comes to saying that design matters to a thriving city development. I think Houston is in a very unique place where you've got really great people who are here to push the city of Houston in a very progressive direction. But we are a city where we're combating development and suburban development. And so that dictating where our infrastructure is kind of invested. And so I think that, regulating design standards and understanding how the vision of our city can be and should look, and policy and regulating and mandating design-based strategy. It's super important to Houston, and I think that we're going in that direction. But I think that the biggest setback for Houston right now is a cultural change, and a cultural change to really prioritize what we know is needed. And that could be cultural. That could be just saying, we're going, I mean, our freeze that we had this year, that wasn't because, we didn't know that we needed to update our infrastructure. It was that we didn't think that we needed to, because we didn't assume something like that would happen to Houston. And so it really is, it has a big deal. I think as Houston wants to thrive, we've got to just make the big hardcore decisions and say, no, we are going in a more sustainable direction. And it just takes cultural change.
Thank you, Brandie. Before we sort of turn to transportation per se and talk a little bit about that, I want to ask what sort of an impact each of you thinks the pandemic has had on thinking about infrastructure. Brandie, you were talking a little bit about some of the things that have come out of it, like people riding their bikes more, people using public space more. Greg was talking about the drop-off in public transportation. Obviously, the pandemic was a shock to the system, to multiple systems at the same time, and was very disruptive. And in many senses, it was also an aha moment about a whole range of issues. And Greg talked about that a little bit earlier in terms of people needing childcare and what happens in schools. In many of our events, we've talked about the digital divide that certainly existed prior to the pandemic, but people became much more aware of it, and it became much more pronounced during the pandemic. From each of your standpoints, as you think about your community in Houston, or Greg, as you think about, and Thomas, sort of developments in cities domestically and around the world, are there any lasting lessons from the pandemic that you see sort of feeding into the way that people are thinking about tackling these challenges that you've outlined? Brandie, let me start with you and see, is Houston drawing any lessons from the pandemic that you think will actually make Houston a better place moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I could even go further back than the pandemic and go back to, Harvey, which was one of the kind of things that pulled me to come to Houston when Hurricane Harvey hit. I was so excited to come to the city because I knew that the conversations I would be involved in would be based on, how do we design with water, and how do we change, our kind of city infrastructure to work with our natural environments, and, all of those hard questions to really redefine and rededicate, networks to work with, our natural environment. And that didn't happen. And as, between, I think, then and then, when the pandemic hit, a lot of the conversation was policy based. A lot of the conversation was, where do we start to regulate what matters in terms of how do we change the way our city works? How are we defining priorities? And the big priority was transit, and then that question of transit within Houston, of course, it was expanding our network, expanding our rail network, but it was why it was important to our streets, because transit really, it supports more walkable urban places. And if we want to get people back on foot, out of the cars, alleviating congestion on our highways, and then taking away the importance of building more high impact infrastructure, and kind of going back to more close-knit, accessible places from that bottom-up approach, that's got to be policy driven and regulated. We've got to start mandating, good people-based, data, infrastructure and networks, the housing, the, more, if it's affordable housing, whatever that development looks like, we've got to start mandating and regulating, not just from the engineering and planning perspective, that on envisioning what we want the city to look like, how it works with our environmental networks, and not only envisioning that, but in regulating what we believe how the city needs to thrive. And once we start regulating our health, and basing our decisions off of public health data, that's also people-based driven. Once we start regulating those design factors, I do believe we'll have a better thriving Houston. But until then, and I don't think that we'll continue to go in that direction, but I think that's going to be what pushes Houston into a more progressive conversation and direction.
Thank you, Brandie. Greg, what about you? What are the lessons that you think people are drawing from the pandemic, or lessons that you're drawing from the pandemic?
In the States, I think they've learned mostly the wrong lessons in many places. I mean, again, the notion that, that the right thing to do is to buy a very large home wherever you can afford it, because simply housing supply is constrained, which typically is probably in a city that's more climate vulnerable than the one you're coming from. And in doing so, taking with the coastal city housing crisis, in New York and the Bay Area, lots of stories about how, prices there were falling. Well, then you look at the fact that people are arriving in places like Boise and Nashville with housing budgets 50% higher. They're, instantly creating an affordability crisis around the entire United States because of failures in those two cities and regions to build more affordable housing. So we're also seeing, of course, a boom in car sales. The United States has this weird inverted market where, used car prices are going up. In fact, in several cases for SUVs and light trucks, the exact vehicles that were the second largest contributor to climate change over the last decade, according to the IEA, head of aviation. Those are the ones that Americans are buying in even greater numbers than before, and recently tipped. So we've seen, again, the response to the pandemic by many Americans is to get bigger and to fall back on individual self-reliance, and exactly, again, sort of the cultural change that Brandie talked about, the fact that we need to think about, integrated development and planning and think about these systems connected. And instead, Americans are like, I'm just going to get the biggest house I can and I'm going to be safe. And I think that's a lesson many of them took away due to a lot of failure of leadership. So again, it's one of those things where I can't blame them in individual cases, but collectively in the aggregate, it's a lot of bad things. One thing I am hopeful for, tying back into some of the cycling that Brandie mentioned, and again, this is what the European governments did, is, the fact that we saw there, that e-bike penetration in Germany went above 10% during the pandemic, that we saw a lot of governments create subsidies and cash for car programs, like in France, to basically subsidize personal electric vehicles. And so, again, Europe has a lot to offer. Nothing's perfect there, but watching city and national and federal governments create these kinds of subsidies and plan for these changes and invest in infrastructure at the street level that will allow that uptake to happen, I think is very encouraging. And I kind of wonder about, again, what else we could do for housing and elsewhere. I mean, another, I guess it's not purely pandemic related, but like I've been studying a lot about, sort of what the British council estates have been doing to hire their own architects and build their own passive house, public housing that has this beautiful vernacular to it. I mean, there's ways to incorporate technology and tradition and, what people love, quote unquote, and do so in ways that are incredible and lower cost while doing so. So, I think the importance of that is underscored during the pandemic as well. That's the biggest wish list I have, watching a lot of what the Europeans did when it comes to rethinking what mobility can be during the pandemic.
So great shout out to Europe and to what's going on in Europe. And so Thomas, when you listen to someone like Greg talk about some of the things that are really working in Europe, what do you sort of see as the things that are working, maybe the things that aren't working, but also for you too, whether there are any lessons that can be drawn from the pandemic as you think about infrastructure issues?
I think the very important issue is that the pandemic was something like a wake-up call. We started to question some certainties, and we are still looking for the new normal. For example, one example would be home office. It was quite uncommon in Germany, and in the last year it became a widespread issue. And the very interesting part will be to see what will the new normal be. I'm pretty sure not everybody will come back to the office. We will find some new structures, and that's really the interesting part right now. What would this new normal be? But on the other hand, there are also not everything is running in the right direction. For example, we had home office, we had much less commuting, but on the other hand, people fled from the public transport. In normal years before the pandemic, we had in Germany about 12 to 13 billion passengers in public transport per year. That was remarkably less last year. Many people who could changed to their car because there was much less traffic, and parking situation was also easier, and they really tried to avoid public transport if they could. Another trend, of course, we have this hefty subsidy for electric vehicles, for example, up to 9,000 euros for a battery electric vehicle right now. Therefore, we have over 20% of new vehicles are electric right now in Germany. This includes plug-in hybrids. But on the other hand, we had a tremendous boom on motorhomes. Really, the sales exploded, totally exploded. And so I would say we have trends that don't fit together, and the new normal is still open. But it's the really good thing is that we started to question our certainties. Is it really is the way we had for 20 years or 30 years? Is it the right one? We started to question that. I think that is a very important issue here. But the future is still wild.
So Thomas, I think that's a really interesting point, or several interesting points. One about the contradictory trends that we're seeing develop as we come out of the pandemic. But the other is, and this ties in with something that Brandie was talking about earlier, sort of the cultural change, or the change in the mindset that you're talking about. Obviously, in places like Germany, people were used to taking public transportation. Because of the pandemic, they tended to avoid that and went for their more independent form of transportation. That's also something that Greg talked about. And so if we sort of drill down for a few minutes and talk about transportation, it seems to me that we've got two competing things going on right now, right? There's, on the one hand, the role that public transportation can play in infrastructure discussions, particularly in urban areas and in cities. And on the other hand, you've got the maintenance and even expansion of traditional infrastructure, roads and bridges. And we've talked a little bit about that already, but how do each of you see sort of changing the mindset to get more people to come back to public transportation, to sort of the common good rather than the individual sort of security, if you will? Who wants to take that on first? Greg is laughing, so I'll take.
I'm laughing because I want to call on Brandie, because I feel it's almost unfair for me to offer platitudes while Brandie's a public servant who's actually working on this. So I would love to hear how she's doing that first, because that's the real work.
I was actually going to say I was more interested in what you guys had to say. It would give me an altering way of thinking about it. I mean, I hate that. I do have a very literal take on it, because I do it, and it's interesting to me to be a part of different ways to think about why things are important, and coming out of the context of how do we get people on board to support something that we know is so important. And I always just default back to the educational factor. What are the best practices and things that are happening in our other cities, and more, I would say, cities that have a more maybe robust transit network. Why is one working so well versus the other? What is that connecting factor that makes it so attractive to the way people want to move versus the way that people want to move in the other city? And my context is in Houston, although I search and I study other cities for best case practices. Here, for sure, we are a traditional city. We like the way we move, getting to our big houses, to our even bigger developments. And there's a default in not wanting to change that. But there is a big driver of folks that are moving to Houston in particular, even Austin. San Antonio is another big place that people are moving to, coming from, I'm from Los Angeles. I live in Houston. People are coming from Arizona. People are coming from all over the state and moving into Texas. And so there is a transition of interest of the way people want to move. And I think that is also supporting the education of people who are coming into our governing agencies, and supporting the education of change within the way our, not only our transit infrastructure, but our development factors, and influencing developers and regulating where developers build, not on our, our watersheds, not overtaking those places. And so there is a slow kind of push, I think, come from the inside of really educating and changing the way people will eventually move around Houston. Maybe in the next 20 years, we have a 2030 metric that we're trying to push versus a resilient Houston, a sustainability goal. Will we make it? I have no idea, but I'm hopeful. But I think putting more metrics on what's getting built and making sure that we're reaching those goals, those sustainability goals, is very important to us.
I'll go just for my addition to this. It's from a cultural standpoint, it's a really interesting question as far as I've studied it, because there's always, of course, the eternal tension between a top-down approach of, you have goals, you have a set of toolkits, they work, culture change is necessary, but then of course there's the bottom-up, the pushback against that, which could be misguided in the case of NIMBYism and other things, but also of course could be, community standing up for themselves. And we saw this early in the pandemic in Oakland and other places where, efforts by planners there to create more sustainable, walkable, street infrastructure got real pushback from communities of color that argued that they were being experimented upon. I remember Oakland in particular had this debate, and it took refinement, it took over time to do that. So I think, from culture change, it's the hardest question in the United States. It can be done. I'm personally a believer, as someone who works on Commotion, which is NewCities sort of mobility festival, that, if you show people great things and give them stuff, they will adapt. We saw overnight adoption of open streets and various places, and we saw the fact that things could change there. And there's, of course, a counter revolution in place in New York and elsewhere, crackdowns on dining and outdoor dining and drinking and pushing back on this. But I think if you show people a vision of what it can be, there is going to be adoption, and then you just simply have to keep ratcheting it up. And then that's been the lesson of the last 15 years in New York, particularly beginning with, with the work Jeanette Sadiq-Khan did there when she was transportation commissioner and closing Times Square and some of the other stuff. So it's that dance, right, between sort of, pushing it forward and sort of reacting and then going back from there. But
so Greg, let me push you on that with a viewer question, and then bring Thomas into the conversation about this and the viewer question. One of our viewers who knows something about this topic and issue because he works in the field writes, the climate advocacy community for decades now has dreamed of large-scale behavioral change as the solution to a host of challenges, but this has been a dismal failure. Don't we have to work within the, quote, traditional infrastructure, end quote, and mobility context in more innovative ways? So, Greg, you've obviously done a lot of work on mobility. I think our viewers could benefit from some of that work. What are some of the innovative ideas that might be easier for people to adopt if we're not looking at wholesale cultural change, because that's difficult to achieve?
Well, with all due respect to the viewer, I'm going to quote The Simpsons back. What is the line? We've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas. I think, obviously the United States has barely scratched the surface. Again, I mentioned, congestion pricing and tolling there. We tried to use carrots in various places, but we've never, ever actually tried to apply the sticks to the Americans because of, things like freedom and other inchoate concepts. So I think, within the context of what we have now, I think there's entire sets of technologies and frameworks we could do to apply pressure on this. Obviously the whole shift to electrification, which we've barely scratched the surface of, is going to destroy the gas tax one way or another, because there will simply be no more gas. And so how do we actually have, road pricing fees? How do we deploy them? There's an incredible whole movement there to do that. And so I agree, you can do that in the context of American automobility. And I'm personally not quite sold the fact that, that if we can shift everyone over to an electric F-150, that will solve climate change, which seems to be the sort of administration's way of doing this. I think there needs to be greater changes to land use and things, but that's doable, and we haven't really done it yet, or we haven't really pushed it as far as we could. I mean, what subsidies for EVs will survive in the infrastructure bill, and and what kind of vehicles it will support, I think is a really big question, and there's ways, of course, to tune that. So yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with you in the sense of yes, like mass behavior change and rethinking everything from scratch is not going to be in the cards. But I don't think we've actually applied even a fraction of what's currently in the toolkit that we have, and so that would be a starting place for me.
Thomas, what about you? What are your thoughts when it comes to sort of the behavior, but also to ways in which we could or should use traditional infrastructure and mobility in more innovative ways than we are right now?
I would say I would say I can see a behavioral change here in Germany right now. I'm just not sure where it will lead us. For example, I think there's quite a bit of a difference between Germany and the US. We are very used to public transport in everything in every bigger town from our perspective. So the public transport is not the real issue with change right now. It's much more bike lanes and so on, especially with pedelecs and so on and so on. You can really see there's an increase in usage, and I'm using the bicycle now for over 10 years to go to the office. So I always take a look on this probably best bike lane in whole Cologne that I use. The rest of it is not a very good network. This one way is quite good, and you can see that there's much more usage. Especially, you can see much more of these cargo bikes and so on and so on. So people are trying right now. Actually, many drivers, you can see that they are really trying. They are not used to the new vehicle right now, but therefore it's really the time where the people try to change to another transportation mode, and we will see how it will look in 1 year or 2 years. But I think there will be quite an impact of it. At least here in Germany, we constructed new bike lanes, for example, here in Cologne, and usage increased. And I think there's quite in the public, people realize that this could be an alternative to their own car. We also have some activities in Berlin, for example. There are activists who want to ban passenger cars, private-owned passenger cars from the whole inner city circle. So there's quite a lot in the move right now. I think the pandemic really gave us a push towards behavioral change. And but on the other hand, we also have huge problems with organizing it. One example would be sector coupling between the energy sector and the transportation sector. We have to do it because we now have the obvious target to put the whole transportation sector in 20 years or so on electric power. It's a really big issue here, and we can see that again our bureaucratic procedures are not fit to provide us enough support to get the targets that were that came from the European Commission last week. For example, the European Commission ordered us to put 2.6% of the whole energy used by transport to get it by renewable energy like PTL and regenerative H2. Actually, we have no idea how we should provide this much energy on this in this way. We will have to import it, but still, it will be difficult, but it's just an example. I think we can see behavioral change by many people, not by everyone, not always in the right direction, but there's a state of flux right now. And on the other hand, we have to admit that our bureaucratic procedures are not very well fitted to support change right now. And I think that's one very big political issue on the federal level that we have to address.
Thomas, thank you. And I'm particularly appreciative that you brought up the coupling of energy and the transportation sector, because during the course of our conversation today, of course, the topic has come up that climate policy needs to be a bigger issue when thinking about infrastructure. And we've not really had an opportunity to unpack that. So thank you for reminding us about the nexus between these two very important issues. We are rapidly running out of time, and I find that very unfortunate, because I could easily continue this conversation with all three of you for another hour or so and still feel like we would just be at the tip of the iceberg. But as we come to a close, I'd like to ask each of you in a minute or so to share with us where you see opportunities for transatlantic cooperation when it comes to addressing some of these common challenges. Obviously, issues like public transportation are local issues, but at the American Council on Germany and certainly at the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung as well, we often feel that there are lessons that can be learned from one side of the Atlantic for the other side of the Atlantic. And so as you sort of grapple with some of these topics and think about some of these issues, is there any low-hanging fruit? Are there any areas where there are opportunities for transatlantic coordination and cooperation? And Thomas, let me come to you first.
Obviously not with public transportation, but I think one big issue that we are discussing right now in Germany and Europe after the Fit for 55 program was released is the opportunity to construct a climate club with the United States, because of the whole program will lead to quite an amount of carbon leakage. And to avoid that, such a construction to get the US on the same boat like us would be quite helpful. I think that's maybe quite far away from infrastructure, but I think right now this is a very important issue for us, that we need to try to get in sync with especially the climate policies, which was really difficult for the last years.
And indeed, of incredible importance as we think about the future. So thank you for that, Thomas. Greg, what about you? Any opportunities for cooperation that you see?
Yeah, quickly. I mean, 2 points that stand out. One of which is that the United States and Germany and the EU more broadly on their recovery efforts should coordinate more closely. I mean, I think it's been commented upon the fact that so much of the global clean tech industry is centered in China, which obviously we recently saw, for example, a number of organizations, including the Sunrise Movement and others, sign a declaration asking the United States not to escalate tensions with China further, which, which I have to say I disagree with, in the sense of it puts the United States in that regard into a position of you can choose to either save the world or and overlook the fate of the Uyghurs, which the Canadian government and the UK have recognized as genocide, as cultural genocide. So I think, obviously from a geopolitical standpoint, we need even closer ties between Germany and the United States to enable the technology transfer and others. And then second, in passing, the United States at some point, as part of its efforts to clean its grid, is going to need its own equivalent of the Energiewende. And I think there's a lot to be shared there, not just on the technology side, but also just simply how to not have the perverse outcomes that Germany has grappled with in terms of pricing and having dirty power flow into the grid at various times, figuring out that load balancing and other sort of really hard-won lessons there. I think there's a lot to be done.
So it's not necessarily the Energiewende as a model, but the Energiewende from which one can learn certain lessons, right? There are some things about it that work very well, and then some things where there were some real pitfalls, where maybe we don't need to make the same mistakes.
Yeah, from a cultural standpoint, I mean, the Energiewende alone is an interesting cultural project that the United States can learn a lot from.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Greg. And Brandie, last but not least, I want to come to you because, of course, you've participated in an ACG exchange program that focused on sustainable development, and you had the opportunity firsthand to learn some lessons from your peers, but also from having visited different cities in the US and in Germany. But as you think about what's going on in Houston, do you see opportunities for transatlantic cooperation?
I do, and I'm still learning. I didn't study economics or economic development, dabbled in it a bit, but I was very encouraged to learn of the sister city relationships between the United States and Germany. And then in particular, having the advantage of visiting Leipzig and knowing that they were Houston's sister city. I think there's a great opportunity to see that expounded on and that relationship where we hold each other accountable when it comes to resilient efforts, sustainability efforts, economic development efforts, and how we can learn more through case studies and what's thriving, what's not thriving, worst best case scenarios of what's allowed one city to prosper, and what those maybe there's a kind of network that we kind of are exchanging information on. Maybe that's the ACG portal, I'm not sure, but it would be really great where that network or that information can be exchanged and understood more closely, because there is a relationship there, and I think that there's an opportunity to take advantage of the learning and understanding from each other a bit more.
Thank you. Thanks, Brandie. Well, a huge thanks to all three of you, Brandie, Greg, Thomas. This was a great hour. And on behalf of both the American Council on Germany and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung USA, I want to thank all three of you for this very thoughtful and very thought-provoking conversation about the past, the present, and the future when it comes to infrastructure in its varied forms. I've really enjoyed the discussion with you, and I hope that our viewers have as well. Thank you very, very much.